Hello. Before I begin this talk on intellectual property, I wanted to get you guys to possibly do me a favor. And I know this is streaming live right now back home in London, and I'm hoping my little nephew Leo is watching rather than watching cartoons because it's his birthday today. So I wanted to get you guys to join me in wishing him a happy birthday. So if we could all please sing along with me. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Leo. Happy birthday to you. Thank you. I really need that help. As you can tell, I wasn't blessed with the greatest singing voice. So I imagine this is his face round about now if he was hearing that song. But the song Happy Birthday is actually an interesting case because since 2015, the song Happy Birthday has actually become a public domain song, so we can all sing it for free and we can all access it for free. But if we were to have sung that song before 2015 at an event such as this, we would possibly be slapped with a lawsuit for copyright breach. And this has affected other industries and other walks of life. If we think of restaurants, for example, before 2015, the waiting staff at restaurants were encouraged to create their own little remixes, strange remixes of the Happy Birthday song when they sung it to customers, just in case there was no possibility of any copyright breaches and any lawsuits that the restaurant may suffer from. And copyright is one aspect of intellectual property that has inspired this talk today. The justification for intellectual property is that it actually furthers and progresses society and human development. But I would actually argue that it restricts human development. Because when we look at the definition of human development, which is the expansion of people's freedoms to live long, healthy, and creative lives, I would actually argue that intellectual property, such as copyright, actually restricts those freedoms. So if we actually look at the definition of what intellectual property is, the World Trade Organization says intellectual property is the rights given to persons over the creations of their minds. And if we have a look at three common intellectual property rights that we've probably seen before: patents, the protection of any inventions; trademarks, the legal protection of any logos, slogans, or words associated with companies; and copyright, just like we talked about with the Happy Birthday song, any protection of artistic work. So the World Trade Organization goes on to justify why intellectual property exists. Why do we have this as a system around the world? Well, they say that the main social purpose is to encourage and reward creative work. Now, I think we've all probably thought in the past, wouldn't it be nice if our creative work could earn us some money? But actually, there's many different industries, many different walks of life where this is not really at the forefront of our mind. And as a result, if we don't think of legally protecting our work, I think you'll find that it actually progresses these industries and makes them more efficient. So if we take, for example, teaching, the one and only thing I know how to do, some might say, is that there's a culture in teaching where we share lesson resources and lesson plans with each other without charging each other for access to these resources. And this goes on every day. It goes on every day in a school like this. And in the 12 years that I've been teaching, I've never once been asked to pay for someone else's resources, and no one has ever offered to pay me for my resources. Maybe they weren't that good, but the point is that there is that culture of sharing without charging for these resources, and I believe that has advanced education much quicker than it would have been under an intellectual property-based system. If we take chefs, for example, a chef will come up with a new meal. The chef will never charge other chefs to access that idea, they will share it amongst each other. And this has advanced the culinary industry a huge amount, as it has with teaching. And really, the only thing chefs and teachers ever ask for their creative work is to be given some recognition, to have their name recognized next to the work. If we look at even a child who will create a magnificent sandcastle, does the child then start charging for other children to stand in the mere presence of this awe-inspiring structure? No, the child will invite other children along to play for free in and amongst the sandcastle, you would hope. Same with DJs. A DJ will create a playlist, share it with friends. They will never charge their friends to have that playlist. And all of these industries, maybe not the sandcastle creating industry, but all of these industries are advancing much more efficiently as a result of not legally protecting their work and charging people for it. So I want to take a couple of examples here of where I think intellectual property is hindering progress in society and hindering the progress of human development. So the first one I want to look at is the pharmaceutical industry. Now, there is no doubt that in the pharmaceutical industry, we've made huge strides from all the money that they have put in the past to developing these life-saving drugs. But, the justification in the pharmaceutical industry is that we charge these high prices, we put patents on these drugs and charge these high prices because we need to recoup the research and development costs that went into creating these drugs. Well, I'm sure we would all agree with that justification. But when we look at it a bit further, if we look at some basic stats, in the last 10 years, the top 10 pharmaceutical companies have earned approximately $700 billion in profit from the prices that they charge because of these patents on the products. Now, $700 billion of profit, that includes, obviously, recouping the research and development costs, and they still have $700 billion left over. So this clearly shows you that some of the drugs they sell have relatively astronomical prices that are earning them these huge profits. And if we take just a couple of examples, if we look at the drug Lemtrada. Now, Lemtrada was originally created in Cambridge University in England to help sufferers of leukemia. And pharmaceutical companies bought this out from the university. They put a patent on the drug, and they put a price of £2,500 on the drug for leukemia sufferers to use. And that alone seems like a relatively high price. But then the pharmaceutical companies did a little bit more research, and they found that this drug actually in smaller doses would help MS sufferers. So what they did was they took the drug off the shelves, they rebranded it as a drug that would now help people who suffer from MS. But what they did was they took it from a price of £2,500 per patient to a price of £56,000 per patient. So it was a 22-fold increase in the price for the exact same drug. Why could they do this? Or how could they do this? Well, number one, they had a patent on the product. They could charge whatever they like. And number two, they realized the market for MS sufferers was wealthier and bigger than the market for leukemia sufferers. If we look at another case, the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa, 90% of the children that suffer from HIV and AIDS are in this region. And this is still a huge crisis solely because the patents on the drugs, and there has been huge advancements on the drugs that can help deal with AIDS and HIV, the prices on these drugs are just too far out of reach for this region of the world. And what's even more frustrating is when you think of diseases like TB and malaria, when only 2 new drugs have been created for TB in the last 50 years, but a far greater amount of money has gone into researching the critical health condition of male pattern baldness. And I mean, this is just so frustrating, isn't it? All of this money that's going into this one particular area that is not as desperate as TB or malaria. But the reason is the cases of TB and malaria occur in developing countries. They tend to, where incomes are much lower, and so the profit potential is much lower compared to relatively wealthy men who have excess money to spend on trying to protect their hair. And this is all as a result of intellectual property rights, putting patents on drugs and charging whatever price can make as much profit for the pharmaceutical companies as possible. If I take one more case in the agricultural industry, we look at the biggest company there, Monsanto. Now, Monsanto kind of broke the mold when it comes to intellectual property. They were the first company that was enabled to put a patent on a natural resource. And what they did was they genetically modified the cotton seed. And they put a patent on it, which obviously gave a relatively high price for it. They targeted Indian farmers, as it was a huge market for them, and they convinced them that this new seed, despite the high price and the debt you will go into for buying this seed, in the long run, you will get greater yields of cotton, you will require less pesticide use, so in the long run, it will be more profitable for the farmers. Well, the farmers, unfortunately, they were sold this idea, but in most cases, the opposite happened. And the yields were lower every year. The need for pesticide use had increased. And also, they were not allowed to replant the crops every year. As part of the patent contract, they had to keep repurchasing the seed from Monsanto. And what we have is an unfortunate statistic that in the past 20 years, over 300,000 Indian farmers have taken their own lives simply because of the debt spiral that they went in as a result of the patent prices on these seeds. And what's even more tragic is most of them took their lives by drinking the very pesticide that put them into debt in the first place. And I think we could see from these cases, and there's many others, that, okay, they are recouping the research and development costs, that's fine. And they are making some profit, that's fine, but it has gone beyond that justification. And actually, it is really a rationalization for greed. And if we finally look at the legal costs of dealing with intellectual property and protecting inventions, we look at these two tech juggernauts, Apple and Samsung. Now, Apple and Samsung have been embroiled in a decade-long patent war over such critical arguments as who was the first company to create the little curvature on the side of a smartphone. Now, this is not only a waste of time for the companies, but what I'm arguing is it's a greater waste of resources for the public because it's the government and the public tax money that is going into providing the courthouses, the public officials, the judges that are presiding over these pointless patent wars that are going on. And if we keep this intellectual property system growing, then what we will have is a growth in patent cases and patent lawsuits. And the courts will never be able to deal with them in the end. So for me personally, I actually got involved in thinking about intellectual property when, unfortunately, about 10 years ago, I developed a chronic autoimmune condition that Western doctors told me there was no cure for. And I was lucky enough that I had access to the UK's National Health Service, which was free, but I still had to pay a huge amount for pharmaceutical drugs that the doctors would prescribe me to help with the condition. And then I would go online and I would be speaking to other people, mainly in the US, who were paying 10 times what I was paying for the same condition, for the same drugs. And at the end result was none of us were curing the condition. But these huge prices, because of the patents on these drugs, were putting us in debt, and we had thousands of pounds worth of bills, and we were getting nowhere. And then I started to look that 25% of these patented pharmaceutical drugs are actually derived from just 1% of the plants in the Amazonian rainforest. And what's even more alarming is that 92% of the plants in the Amazon have not even been explored by Western scientists for medicinal use. So with absolutely no science background whatsoever, I decided to take a trip to the Amazon jungle and spend some time with the local doctors there who might be able to tell me about certain plants that we're not aware of in the West that could maybe help me with my condition. And when I got to the Amazon, I got to stay with some of the local doctors, they're called local shamans there, who, when I talked to them about these pharmaceutical drugs I was taking in the West, they just laughed at me. They couldn't understand it. They did not understand intellectual property. Didn't make sense to them. Patents didn't make sense to them. Their culture is a culture of open source, free to access drugs, plants, medicinal plants, whatever it is that's going to help your health problems. They provided all of these for free. I don't even know what they were, to be honest with you. I had no knowledge of what they were. I just put my trust in them. And they would have different concoctions of plants for different ailments. And 3 weeks later, as a result of this free-to-access domain, I pretty much was cured, and I live a much better quality of life as a result of this intellectual property-free culture that they have in the Amazon. And it wasn't just me. I obviously made some friends over there, such as my friend here, who came into the Amazon in a wheelchair suffering from MS. And 3 weeks later, after taking these free-to-access plants from the local doctors, walked out on her 2 feet with absolutely no assistance whatsoever. And I could go on and on about the cases here. So when I came back from the Amazon, I thought to myself, a change in this patented, intellectual property system is not only necessary, but it is inevitable. And we can see that in other industries. There is a culture changing here. If we look at something like the music industry, we look at Spotify or Apple Music, a lot of us use these services now. So originally what we used to have to do is pay maybe $15, $20 for an album, and we would get 10 songs. Now we're paying, I don't know, $10, $15 for access to every song almost that was ever made at our disposal whenever we want to play them. How has this happened? Why has this happened? Because we have done what we do best. We wanted to always share music. And when technology advanced, we wanted to share music and look beyond the copyrights. I'm sure a lot of us have probably shared music with friends, family, or people online without really thinking about the copyright laws and how much we should really be paying for doing this. But as a result, it's forced the industry to change and adapt. And that's why they've now created music streaming services, which makes it much more accessible for us to access the songs that we like. Some people might say, however, this is hurting the artists. The artists aren't making as much money anymore. Well, I would say the artists now, it's a better setup. They make most of their money by touring around the world, live shows, which benefits us. We benefit from more live shows than ever before. Benefits them because they get to interact with their fans much more. And if we take an artist such as Radiohead have now adapted to this more open source culture. They put an album on their website in 2011 and said to people, you can download this for free if you want, but you can also pay us whatever you feel this album deserves. Whether it's 1 cent or $100, it's up to you. And much more bands are starting to do this. They're looking beyond the normal prices that copyright would put on albums. They are enabling us to access the albums for free and just pay whatever we feel the artist deserves or what we feel like we want to pay the artists. And we see this in other areas as well. We see crowdfunding websites that have opened up, such as GoFundMe. We can now donate or pay whatever we feel is the right amount of money for a certain product idea, a certain invention, a certain fundraising campaign. We can now dictate the prices. The prices are not being dictated by intellectual property as much in some of these industries. We're not forced to pay a certain price. Look at Wikipedia. Did we ever think the Encyclopedia Britannica monopoly on knowledge would ever be broken? We used to have to pay hundreds of dollars just to access a part of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now Wikipedia has given us an open source base, an open source domain to access infinite knowledge that has actually helped educate many more, millions more people than would have been educated under an intellectual property-based system. So I know what people will say, well, we need intellectual property. We need it for competition. Well, yes, competition does drive innovation. But what I would say is competition and these companies, they are more interested in competing for market share than they are in competing to figure out ways to develop society more. I think if we had a more open-based system, an open source system, where crowds of people could decide what are we going to do with these resources, rather than a small boardroom of 10 people deciding what can we create to make the most profit, this would be much more efficient for society. And if we think of the pressing issues in society right now, such as the gross income inequality, for example, in the US, we have 3 individuals have a total wealth of a combined 50% of the rest of the US population. We have climate change issues increasing every year, and we have child poverty rates at the highest levels in recorded history. A restrictive intellectual property system is not helping these issues. What will help these issues is a more open-based, free-to-access system that society can benefit from. So to conclude here, I would say, look, how can we sit there and tell our children that they must share the food that they have with other children, they must share their toys, they must share their games, when we sit here consciously knowing that this system of restrictive access to resources exists and costs people who really depend on these life-saving drugs who cannot access them. And I think we could take a lot from the culture in the Amazon, which, as I said, is open sourced, free to access, and it prioritizes community over individual monetary reward. Thank you.